They say the brain can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds after a person is decapitated. 30 long, grotesque seconds where the eyes may still blink, the lips may attempt to form words, and some flicker of thought may still move behind. The eyes. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, this wasn't just a theoretical horror. It was a final, chilling reality in a carefully staged spectacle meant to erase her from history. Anne Boleyn's execution is often summarized in a few clean lines: beheaded for treason, adultery, and incest, replaced swiftly by Jane Seymour, and forgotten in the annals of Tudor history. But this simplification does more than distort. It hides the true violence behind her death, not just the swing of the sword, but the psychological warfare that led her there. In reality, her final days weren't a quiet fade into history. They were a calculated unraveling of a woman, too powerful, too outspoken, too inconvenient to be allowed to live. In May of 1536, Anne Boleyn waited in the Tower of London. The very same place that had once been the threshold to her coronation now served as her prison. Just 3 years earlier, she had ridden in a golden barge along the Thames, crowned in grandeur at Westminster Abbey. She had been England's queen, beloved by some, hated by others, but undeniably powerful. Now she was stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, and subjected to one of the most meticulously orchestrated humiliations in royal history. Anne was held in the Queen's lodgings, a chamber that had once echoed with music and laughter, now consumed by whispers and dread. The tower, cold and gray, did not offer silence. It pulsed with anticipation. Servants passed her food with eyes lowered. Her ladies-in-waiting wept behind closed doors, and the walls seemed to lean in with every passing hour. Henry had summoned a French swordsman, an unusual choice, almost exotic, bypassing the traditional English axe. Some historians have called it mercy, but the truth is that it was theater. The swift sword from Calais was cleaner, more precise, and above all, more symbolic. A spectacle had to be perfect. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Her execution date was scheduled, then rescheduled, not once, but twice. Each day, she awoke unsure if it would be her last. This was no accident. It was an intentional psychological tactic. Modern psychologists might call it chronic anticipatory trauma, a form of mental abuse where the mind endures death repeatedly before it even comes. Every sunrise brought with it not just fear, but exhaustion. Anne was being dismantled, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. Witnesses at the time described her demeanor as unnaturally calm. They said she smiled, that she joked, that she even laughed. But this wasn't serenity. This was dissociation. A defense mechanism so deep that it allowed her to create a mental distance between herself and the horror closing in. When she quipped about having a little neck and spoke with gallows humor, she was not being brave. She was breaking. Quietly, elegantly, tragically. She asked for the sacrament at 2:00 a.m. on the day she was originally told she would die. She knelt before the host in prayer for hours, eyes red with fatigue, body trembling from sleeplessness. She did not sleep. That night, how could she? Her thoughts, fractured by fear and insomnia, circled endlessly her daughter, her legacy, her God, and the sword that awaited her. The next morning, the guards didn't come. Her death had been delayed. Again. By now, the women around her didn't know whether to comfort her or prepare her. The room became a stage of mourning without a corpse. Each hour stretched into torment. Anne, the woman who had once enchanted an entire court, who had helped to birth a reformation, was now reduced to waiting for the final scene of her own demise. But the execution was never meant to be a simple punishment. Henry wanted something more enduring than death. He wanted erasure. And it began with the accusations: adultery, incest with her own brother, conspiracy to murder the king. Charges so grotesquely fabricated that even her enemies raised eyebrows. Yet it didn't matter. The machinery had already been set in motion, and truth was never part of the plan. Anne was stripped of her dignity and of her identity. Her portraits were removed from palaces. Her crest was chiseled off stone walls. Her name became a whispered warning at court, a lesson in how far a woman could rise before she needed to be destroyed. Those who had once bowed before her now avoided her gaze. Those who had praised her wit and charm now wrote verses condemning her as a seductress and a traitor. The transformation was complete. She was no longer Anne, the queen. She was Anne, the condemned, and still the king did not come. Henry VIII remained at Whitehall Palace, planning his next wedding, while the mother of his daughter awaited execution. He did not look her in the eye. He did not offer final words. He sent a swordsman instead. When the guards finally came, Anne was standing. She laughed again, the sound sharp, brittle. Her ladies helped her into the plain gown she would die in. The walk to the scaffold was short, but it stretched like eternity. The corridors she passed through were the same ones she had once walked in triumph. Now her footsteps echoed hollow. No trumpets, no crowds, just the cold hush of inevitability. The scaffold at Tower Green stood only 3 feet off the ground. There was no towering platform, no elevation. It was a deliberate design choice. She would not be given the dignity of height. She would die close to the crowd, her humiliation as visible as her fall. The people who had gathered were not silent mourners. It was a spectacle. Some cheered, others jeered. The execution of a queen was public theater, and the tickets were free. And stood tall, head high, her eyes scanning the crowd she could know. Long trust. Her final speech was brief, carefully constructed. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. According to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die. I will accuse no man. These were not just words. They were code. A final act of defiance hidden beneath obedience. She would not confess. She would not bow to the false narrative. But she would speak in a way that protected those she left. Behind most of all, her daughter. Then came the blindfold. Often seen as a mercy, but in truth, it was to prevent flinching. The swordsman needed her to remain still, and knelt upright, as was the French tradition. She did not place her head on a block. She used the last of her strength to stay poised. The wind moved through Tower Green. Somewhere, a bird sang. The crowd shifted. The air tightened. She whispered a prayer. Her lips moved, her eyes hidden, her breath steady. She waited and waited. The swordsman was trained to strike when least, expected to prevent anticipation. There would be no count, no warning, only silence. Then the sword, honed to perfection and balanced for a single horizontal strike, whispered through the air. A sound so swift it barely existed, followed by an unnatural stillness. Then finality. One clean motion. Her head, once crowned, in gold and surrounded by music, now rolled gently from her shoulders, hair falling in waves around her lifeless face. Her lips, still moving, formed what some claimed were the remnants of prayer. Her eyes, wide open, seemed to blink once. Then again, witnesses gasped. Several fainted. Others turned their faces away, unable to process the dissonance of death arriving in such silence. But there was no pause in the performance. The executioner raised her severed head by the hair, displaying it to the crowd in a ritualistic gesture confirmation. that the sentence had been carried out. Blood still pumped from the stump of her neck, painting her dress, the scaffold, and the linen held by her weeping ladies. The crowd, once animated, now stood in stunned silence, as if momentarily aware of their complicity in something far darker than royal justice. And a coffin had been prepared. No priest stood by to offer final rites. The Queen's body, now headless, was left to the mercy of her grieving attendants. Desperate, they searched the tower for anything in which to place her remains. What they found was an old arrow chest, splintered and crude. They lined it hastily with cloth, gently laying her body and head inside with trembling hands. The image of those noble women, forced to piece together what had been undone, haunted them for years. Some never recovered. One took religious vows and entered a convent, unable to speak Anne's name without tears. She was buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel floor, hurriedly, quietly, like a secret the kingdom wanted to forget. No royal tomb, no processional, no moment of reflection. The woman who had once captured the heart of a king, who had challenged the Pope, redefined queenship, and brought forth the future Elizabeth I was discarded. Not just killed, but erased. The grave held her bones, but not her story. That, too, had been buried beneath layers of fear, politics, and silence. But Henry's efforts didn't stop at the grave. Her portraits were seized and destroyed. Her initials were scratched out from wood and stone. Letters written in her name were burned. Courtiers who had once praised her now avoided the mere mention of her. Even her friends, terrified by the fate they had witnessed, adopted a silence that protected their lives at the cost of her memory. Henry VIII had not only executed Anne Boleyn, he had waged war against her legacy. And for a time, he had nearly succeeded. Her daughter, Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate. Stripped of royal status, her household was dissolved, and she was left without proper clothing or attendance. The child who would one day become the greatest monarch in English history was abandoned, an inconvenient reminder of a woman the king wanted forgotten. Her small world, once filled with songs, lessons, and courtly laughter, became cold and quiet. She was no longer the heir to the throne. She was the daughter of a disgraced woman, and she would grow up beneath the shadow, the trauma of Anne's death did not end with the blade. It rippled outward, infecting those who had seen it, those who had feared it, and those who had survived it. The court itself became quieter, more cautious. Women no longer spoke as freely. Men watched their words more closely. The tower, once a fortress of stone, became a living symbol of fear. And Henry, the man who orchestrated it all, returned too. His life as if nothing had happened. The day after Anne's execution, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, they were married. There were no signs of mourning, no tribute, no moment of silence. Anne's name was never mentioned. Again in court, the king had moved on. England had moved on. The machinery of monarchy had swallowed a queen and kept turning, indifferent to the blood still drying on the scaffold. But the horror of Anne's death lay not just in its speed or spectacle, it lay in its design. Her execution had been planned, not as a punishment, but as a message. A public declaration of what happens to women who ascend too far, speak too boldly, or challenge too deeply. She was not merely executed. She was deconstructed. Every aspect of her womanhood, her love, her sexuality, her ambition had been turned against her. The charges of adultery and incest, absurd by any standard, were tools. They weren't meant to convince the wise. They were meant to humiliate, to make her unworthy of sympathy, to justify the injustice, and they worked. The men who were executed alongside her, 5 in total, including her own brother George, were paraded as proof. Their deaths were timed to precede hers, ensuring no final declarations of innocence could interfere with the king's version of events. They died with dignity, but their fates were sealed by the same lies that condemned Anne. Their bodies were buried, their names whispered, their stories cut short, all in the service of one man's desire to reshape his future by erasing his past. This was not just the execution of a queen. It was the state-sponsored murder of a narrative. Anne Boleyn's downfall was not a singular act of cruelty, but a campaign of character assassination so thorough, so strategic, that even centuries later, many still struggle to separate the myth from the truth, and that's where the real horror lies, not in the flash of the sword, not even in the silence that followed, but in the realization that an entire government, an entire society, can be bent toward the destruction of a single woman just because she dared to stand beside a king, rather than behind him. Anne's story didn't end with her death. It lingered, like a whisper beneath the stones of the tower, like a ghost in the halls she once walked. But for years, centuries, even her name was either vilified or erased. Henry's propagandists worked fast. Poems that once praised Anne's wit and beauty were rewritten into verses of betrayal and seduction. Official accounts reframed her execution as merciful, emphasizing the so-called gentleness of a sword over the brutal English axe. They spoke of her death with the clinical detachment of bureaucracy, as though it were a necessary formality. But those who had seen it knew better. The Tudor state didn't just kill Anne Boleyn, it turned her into a warning. Her story was sanitized and reshaped to serve as a deterrent to any other woman who might rise too far or speak too freely. History books reduced her to a footnote, a misstep, a tragic figure whose fatal flaw was ambition. But behind the pages and between the lines, there was another version of Anne that refused to die, the woman who endured betrayal, gaslighting, and psychological dismantling by a system designed to consume her. The orchestration of her execution mirrored modern psychological torture techniques. Isolation, sleep deprivation, disorientation, the strategic spread of false information. All were employed not to extract truth, but to dismantle Anne's sense of self. During her imprisonment, she was denied rest. She was bombarded with invented tales of infidelity and incest. She was cut off from allies and subjected to constant surveillance. Her spirit wasn't merely broken, it was dissected. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of Anne's downfall, engineered every piece of the narrative. He collected false confessions through coercion, used them to condemn 5 men, and then used their deaths to reinforce Anne's guilt. Every detail was controlled. Even the date and time of her execution were chosen to maximize visibility. Morning hours allowed for the attendance of court officials and spectators, while the ringing of church bells signaled her death across the city, turning her private agony into a public ritual of dominance. The crowd that gathered wasn't there to mourn. They were there to watch a queen fall, and they were encouraged to cheer. Planting vocal supporters in the crowd was a common tactic. The idea was to shape public sentiment in real time to drown out dissent with pre-approved enthusiasm. And it worked. Anne was mocked, jeered, and reduced to a cautionary tale. The spectacle of her execution wasn't just about ending her life. It was about reinforcing the king's authority over every soul watching. Power didn't just punish. It humiliated. Even the scaffold was constructed with that purpose in mind. A low platform kept Anne close to the crowd, close enough for her humiliation to be intimate. There was no dramatic rise, no distant, royal distance. Just a woman stripped of everything made to kneel before a mass of strangers as they watched her final moments. It was cruelty disguised as justice, pageantry disguising fear. After her burial in the unmarked grave, Anne's presence was slowly erased from the physical world. Her initials were chipped from palace walls. Tapestries that bore her symbol were burned or replaced. Artists were ordered to destroy or alter her portraits. No monument, no eulogy, nothing left to remind the world she had ever reigned. The court, always sensitive to the king's shifting winds, fell quickly into line. Mentioning her name was considered dangerous. Her friends, her ladies, her supporters silenced by fear, yet the truth is, Anne had never been universally hated. Many at court admired her intelligence, her reformist ideas, and her resilience. She had been a patron of scholars, a reader of forbidden texts, and a woman with her own voice in a world that demanded silence. But once Henry turned against her, so did the tide of opinion. In a society where the king's will shaped reality, loyalty to a condemned queen became treason by association. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was too young to understand any of this. At less than 3 years old, she was stripped of her titles and declared illegitimate. She was relocated, her belongings taken, her attendants dismissed. In a matter of hours, she went from heir to outcast. The trauma of that sudden abandonment would shadow her life and shape her reign. Elizabeth would grow into a woman who understood, better than most, the volatility of power and the cost of being female in a man's world. Anne's execution didn't just traumatize those who loved her. It transformed the entire atmosphere of the English court. From that point on, it was a place of whispered fears and calculated smiles. Ambition was masked in modesty, intelligence hidden behind charm. Every woman who rose in station carried Anne's ghost with her, a reminder that too much visibility could end with steel on the neck. The narrative built around Anne that she was guilty, dangerous, unfaithful was convenient. It gave the court an excuse to look away. It gave the public a reason to believe justice had been served. But in truth, Anne had been condemned because she was no longer useful to the king. She had failed to give him a male heir. Her charisma had become a threat. Her influence, once flattering, now irritated his pride. The very qualities that had made her irresistible were the ones that made her expendable. And so, history did what power always demands: it rewrote itself. Anne became the villain in her own tragedy. Her voice silenced, her image blurred, her reputation shattered. She was remembered not as a reformer or a mother or a political thinker, but as a cautionary tale, a woman undone by desire. It would take centuries before historians began peeling back those layers, seeking the woman beneath the myth. Some records, long buried, revealed her kindness. Others, her wit. Still others showed a woman trying to navigate an impossible role with grace. A queen without precedent. A thinker ahead of her time. A mother robbed of her daughter. But these fragments were fragile, and many were lost. Her story, pieced together from whispers, remains incomplete. Even the site of her execution is uncertain. Though Tower Green holds a memorial, historians believe the true scaffold stood elsewhere. The ambiguity of location mirrors the ambiguity of her memory. She exists in half light, half hero, half villain, half remembered, half forgotten. But the truth, messy, brutal, and necessary, still survives in the silence between the lines. It survives in the realization that Anne Boleyn's greatest crime wasn't betrayal or adultery. It was power. It was refusing to apologize for her intelligence. It was daring to believe she could be more than a pawn in a king's game. Her death wasn't justice. It was a warning. And like all warnings, it says more about those who issue it than the one who receives it. There is a haunting irony in the way Anne Boleyn's legacy ultimately defied the king who tried to erase her. Despite Henry's immense efforts to dismantle every piece of her identity, to turn her into a cautionary tale, the woman he executed became the mother of one of England's most iconic and enduring monarchs. Elizabeth I would rise from the ashes of her mother's disgrace, ruling with a fierce intellect and indomitable will. And though she rarely spoke of Anne, her entire reign seemed to carry the echo of her mother's unfinished story, a woman too bold for her time, silenced by power, but never truly forgotten. Still, the path from Anne's death to her symbolic resurrection in history was long and obscured. For generations, she remained more myth than woman, villain or martyr, seductress or victim. The details of her life were twisted by those who had the power to write the story, men who needed her to be weak, sinful, foolish. In that controlled narrative, Anne was a threat neutralized, a lesson learned, but history has a way of resisting silence. In time, fragments of Anne's truth surfaced, letters hidden away, observations preserved in the journals of courtiers, quiet tributes from those who had loved her, feared for her, and grieved her loss. These fragments, however incomplete, began to reassemble a picture of a woman far more complex than the one the Tudors allowed. She wasn't perfect. She was ambitious, yes. She made enemies. She played court politics with sharp edges. But she was also a visionary, a patron of education and religious reform, a woman who dared to speak when silence was safer. She was a woman who walked into the fire of power knowing it could burn her, and it did. The psychological toll of her final days cannot be overstated. Modern mental health experts would likely describe her experience as a combination of acute trauma, prolonged stress exposure, and institutional gaslighting. The uncertainty of her execution date, the isolation, the manipulation of reality, and the deliberate shattering of her self-worth were not just cruel, they were calculated, designed to make her question everything: her faith, her memory, her very sense of identity. And when she stepped onto that scaffold, it wasn't only her body they were ending. It was her version of the truth. The sword may have struck swiftly, but it followed weeks of systematic mental dismantling. The same tools used in psychological warfare today, disruption of sleep, degradation of the self, disinformation campaigns, were used with disturbing precision in Anne's case. Henry's court, for all its pageantry and medieval trappings, understood the power of perception. They didn't just kill Anne. They made her complicit in her own destruction by controlling the story around her, and this control extended to every corner of Tudor society. In the aftermath of her death, fear settled over the court like a heavy fog. People spoke in whispers. Some burned letters. Others fled. Trust vanished. It became understood that the same forces that had turned Anne into a traitor could turn on anyone. The sword that had ended her life hung invisibly above many more necks. Compliance became survival. Silence became currency, yet Anne's execution could not be wholly buried. The raw spectacle of it, the trauma, the injustice, it left scars. It raised questions that no one dared answer aloud. Why had a queen been accused so suddenly? Why had the charges been so absurd? Why had the king been so quick to remarry? For those who could not voice their doubts, these questions remained unanswered ghosts, lingering in the minds of everyone who had once bowed before her. Anne's story began to resurface during Elizabeth's reign, albeit cautiously. There was no grand rehabilitation, no public declaration of innocence, but there were subtle acknowledgments. The inclusion of her maternal lineage in Elizabeth's heraldry, The quiet support given to artists and scholars who portrayed Anne with nuance. The reintroduction of her influence into English religious reform long after her death. Elizabeth didn't need to say her mother's name. Her reign itself became a living act of redemption. In modern times, Anne's legacy has undergone a remarkable transformation. No longer merely a tragic queen or dangerous seductress, she has become a symbol of resilience, autonomy, and the danger of female power in patriarchal systems. Writers, historians, and artists have revisited her story with new eyes no longer blinded by Tudor propaganda. They have questioned the sources, challenged the myths, and in doing so, recovered fragments of Anne's humanity. Not the saint, not the sinner, just the woman, and perhaps that is what makes her story so enduring. It speaks to a timeless fear, the fear of being silenced, misunderstood, erased, but also to a timeless hope that even in death, the truth has a way of finding its voice. Anne Boleyn's greatest tragedy may have been that her story was twisted to suit a king's narrative. But her greatest triumph is that, centuries later, she still speaks. Through historians, through the legacy of her daughter, through every retelling that refuses to accept the official version, her death was intended to be an ending. But in truth, it became a beginning. A cautionary tale turned rallying cry. A spectacle meant to enforce obedience that now invites reflection. In understanding the full depth of her final days, the psychological torment, the public degradation, the attempt to wipe her from memory, we gain more than historical insight. We gain a warning about how power behaves when challenged, about how easily truth can be rewritten when only one voice is allowed to speak, about how even in the most gilded courts, the greatest crime a woman can commit is refusing to be quiet, and Boleyn was not just a queen who lost her head. She was a woman who dared to matter. And though her body was buried without honor, her story continues to rise. It rises in every woman silenced by fear. It rises in every person unjustly accused. It rises in the pages of history books no longer written by kings, and it rises, most of all, in the simple act of remembering her, not as the traitor she was painted to be, but as the human being she truly was.